picking stuff up over here. Hello. Hi, everyone. Okay, stop chatting. Sit down. How's your first day? Thumbs up? Yes? Good for you. Glad to hear it. Tonight we have a great night. I'm David Simpson. I'm the program director here at the Fine Arts Working Center. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am glad to see you. You're in for a treat tonight. Every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday throughout the summer, we do public open events for that our faculty events. So faculty do readings and artist talks, and we do really interesting Q&As afterwards. So I'm glad you're here. We still have tomorrow night and the next night and one more week of summer programming until we wrap it up for the summer. So there's some great events, wonderful faculty this week and next week. So if you're around, be sure to come. I think you won't regret it. Tonight we're going to hear from poet Jessica Jacobs. Who here is in Jessica's workshop? Can we do an extra big round of applause for Jessica because she's here? And we're also going to hear from visual artist Melissa Wilkinson. Who's in Melissa's workshop? Hands up. Yay! Big hand for Melissa. Jessica will be signing books, and her books are for sale at the back of the room after the workshop. So I encourage you to grab the books because they will go. I hope they go. And there are more books by faculty members at the back and also in the library in the gallery. So be sure to check that out after the reading. While you're in the gallery, be sure to check out the show. The exhibition that we have up right now for the summer is wonderful. It's curated by former fellow Heidi Hahn, and it features work by about 20 or so former fellows. It's a gorgeous exhibition, so be sure to check it out afterwards. What else? Big shout out to East End Books for managing our bookstore. Every now and again, there's someone from East End Books actually here, so I just like to, it makes them feel good whenever they're here. It happens 1 out of every 10 times, but I'm also grateful to Cape Cod 5 Savings Bank for their generous support of our public programming in the summer. Restrooms are down the hall on the left if you need them. The sign-up sheet, this is very important. I'm just going to go check that one. There are 4 brave souls who have signed up. 5. There are 5 brave souls, although one of them is signed up on the second page of the sign-up sheet because we go in order. Strategic. Cell phones. It's on my list. Okay, thank you for the reminder, Jessica. Tomorrow night, if you want to do the introductions, it's totally fine. Jessica Jacobs, everybody. Yes. Student night is Thursday night. This is your chance to get up and get a lot of love from everyone else on the stage. It's a wonderful experience. If you're nervous, that's reasonable, but overcome that nervousness and sign up if you haven't to read. You won't regret it. Finally, per Jessica's suggestion, what was that again? I forgot. You have to turn off your cell phones or turn them to silent, and let's get started. I'd like to invite up one of Jessica Jacobs' students, Amy Eisner, to introduce Jessica.
Thank you. Poet and essayist Jessica Jacobs earned her BA from Smith College and her MFA from Purdue, and they may have taught her well because she is a renowned teacher whose reputation precedes her. Half my class is here because they just want to be wherever Jessica is. And although this is my first time studying with Jessica, I am also here because of her, which I'll explain in a moment. Jessica has published the books Take Me With You Wherever You're Going, In Whatever Light Left to Us, and Pelvis with Distance. Her newest book, Unalone, which is in conversation with the book of Genesis, is set to come out next year from 4 Way Books. Jessica's poems and writings have been featured in Orion, New England Review, and the Writer's Chronicle, among other venues. She holds a Devil's Kitchen Award, a Goldie Award, and a New Mexico Book Award. Jessica has been editor-in-chief of Sycamore Review, a chapbook editor for Beloit Poetry Journal, a member of the North Carolina Writers Network Board of Trustees, and is both founder and executive director of Yetzirah, a hearth for Jewish poetry. Yetzirah has a reading series during the year, which I am really looking forward to tuning into this year. You can do so virtually. I invite you to do the same, to do that. And as one of the 36 participants in Yetzirah's first annual Jewish Poetry Conference, I can tell you that this organization, Yetzirah, has been greeted with a huge yes and endless gratitude from hundreds of Jewish poets who had wondered why they had a Jewish world over here and a poetry world over there, and had been longing for a home where we could be and become more fully ourselves. I can also tell you that the Poetry Conference itself, which took place in June in Asheville, North Carolina, was the most wonderful poetry gathering I've ever experienced, with amazing faculty, excellent poetry from every participant, and an ethos of genuine interest and attention to one another that is exceedingly rare and entirely attributable to its leadership. It was historic. And now let me hand the mic to Jessica Jacobs, whose poems, as former poet laureate Ada Limon has put it, pay necessary homage to what truly matters.
Yeah, thank you. The problem with introductions that are that lovely is now I have to read my poems. So thank you, Amy. That was beautiful. Thank you, David and Sarah and Miracle and Bree and Stephanie and the rest of the crew here. It's such an honor to be back. And my workshop, my God, you all have showed up already. I'm just so excited for our week together. And you have been super vulnerable already, and I will do that in return right here in public with, apparently I'm being filmed, so hello, virtual world. I'm going to begin with a poem from my most recent book because I think it embodies a lot of the questions that brought me to read the Torah, to read sacred texts, and to want to write in conversation with them. So for me, when I was married, especially when I was first married, I was very surprised by something, and I'm sure that this is completely just me, but when I'm doing something like, say, like going for an awesome bike ride or a run, I tell myself stories about how amazing I am. I know you all have never done that. But in my mind, like, I am just like this superhero. It's great. And then you live with someone every single day, and there's like a little disparity between like this superhero in my head, yeah, and the person over the breakfast table. So a question to ask once the honeymoon is over. Big around as my bike helmet and high as my ankle. The box turtle was halfway from my side of the road to the other. The warm sun felt delicious, my legs strong, and it was almost to the center line. I hadn't been passed by a car for miles. Figuring if it was still there, I'd pick it up on the way back. I cycled past. Years before, the woman across the street was shaped like that turtle, or more like a toadstool, really. Squat bell of a body atop the thin stalks of her legs, milky and bare beneath her frayed black house dress. It hurt her to move, clear even from my second-story window. So she brought her trash out in increments, in small, bursting grocery bags. She tossed each out the door onto the porch, then nudged them one step to the next before easing carefully, painfully herself down, a step at a time. Then she towed them finally, slowly into a crumpled heap at the curb. I left my window to help, then took her trash out every week after. That story. I hadn't yet told it to my wife. Had I? But there was the turnaround quicker than expected, and I spun to find a beat-down bus trailed by all the fuming cars that hadn't passed me. Steadying my handlebars against the wind, I rode back hard, dodging around crushed squirrels and tire-splayed birds. The turtle was just where I'd left it, but with the top of its shell torn away. The dead turtle, a raw red bowl, its blood slashing the twinned yellow lines into an unequal sign, as in A is unequal to B, as in thinking about doing the right thing is not the same as doing it. As in, how many times did I watch that old woman shuffle bags down the stairs? Really, how many? Before I went from watching to helping. As in, with my wife beside me, I am the woman who does not hesitate to lay down her bike and give a small life safe passage. As in, I bike slowly home, told no one. As in, will she love me less when she learns I am not equal to the person I am when she is watching? This will not be uplifting. I'm sorry. The penultimate poem has a joke in it, so just wait, I promise. Okay, so the rest of the poems are from this new collection, which is entirely in conversation with the book of Genesis, which, if you have read it, is dark. So, sorry. But there's this really fascinating body of literature that's built around Torah, which is called Midrash. And in the classical sense is like rabbis writing for hundreds of years, kind of trying to understand the text, see how it applies to them, to the contemporary life. But underlying this idea is something called Torah Tamima, which is, in a basic translation, Torah is perfect. So they approach this text as though it is not only sacred, but as though it is perfect. And what happens when you approach something that way is, if something is hard, if it triggers you, you can't turn away from it, right? You can't just set it aside and walk out of the room. You have to sit with it long enough that it becomes your teacher. And for me, one of the stories that was the most difficult is the binding of Isaac, when Abraham is tested by being commanded to sacrifice his son. And this poem begins with a quote from the philosopher Erich Hoffer. Why there is no Hebrew word for obey. What came later was the real trial, because God knew Isaac would not die while Abraham climbed the mountain believing he would. With conviction tempered in the fires of his faith, he walked up through the shaded valley, his son resolute ahead on the trail. Behind them, Sarah, Isaac's mother, Abraham's wife, a small darkness in the distance, growing forever smaller. He bound his beloved son, pulled back his legs, wrenched back his arms, knotted his ankles to his wrists, and laid him on that altar like a child falling through the sky. He held the knife, knowing from every animal he'd ever sacrificed how his son would jerk and shudder when the blade opened his throat, the familiar smoke of offered flesh. What came later, even with Isaac alive in the fields, inside Abraham was the knowledge of what he'd been willing to do. When they passed in the tent, Isaac rubbed a remembered ache in his shoulder and never again held his father's eye. Sarah, smelling the imagined ashes on her husband's fingers, the blood in the crease of his throat, turned from him in the night. And on every path Abraham walked from that day forward, his son as he had been, a small back, barely the span of his hand, slung with the kindling meant for his burning. Seconds from the slaughter of the one meant to carry his line of the son he'd wanted all his life, who's to say the voice in his head was God? Judaism is not a faith, but a tradition. And isn't doubt the crux of conscience? Yet what came later on a Sabbath morning centuries on was a congregation in Pittsburgh reading this story of Isaac's binding, of Abraham's terrible bind, when a man burning with unquestioning belief entered with a gun and, with no better angel to stay his hand, opened fire, believing the death of Jews would keep our country safe, believing this massacre, elderly congregants bleeding out on the floor, was God's work. Who would call such actions holy? And how many more times will each of us come down from the mountain, conviction knocking like a knife in our belt loop, stained with all we would have done? My daily gods are minor ones, of pride, of lust, of impatience and complacency. Yet how many have I harmed on the way to what I thought was right, or, with hindsight, on the way to what I wanted? And how many sorry sacrifices have I made of myself? What if we turned from certainty and arm ourselves instead with questions? Obey, obey, obey is everywhere in translation. The real word is Shema. Listen. Sitting again with this story also helped me write about some of the things that were happening in my life that were very hard to deal with in the real world, but also to write about. And what I found was that being able to look at something far away from me, right, to be able to look at the story of someone else allowed me to then, the distance I needed to write about my own life. And there's a Midrashic story that while Abraham and Isaac are up on the mountain, Satan comes to Sarah and tells her that Abraham has gone through with it and has actually killed Isaac, and her soul flies out of her body in response. So this is one of the many stories that is built around this. While this was, I was doing all the study, my mom has slowly been succumbing to Alzheimer's. So I kind of started to think about mothers and children. So a quote from this midrash: "If God has chosen me," Isaac replied, "I shall willingly surrender my soul. But I am gravely concerned about my mother." Kaddish for the living. While Abraham and Isaac were up on the mountain, Satan dropped by to Schrödinger Sarah, saying her son was dead, but not. Unable to hang on that particular cliff, her heart plunged over and, before the story's end, stopped. Stopped as a perpetual motion machine given in to its impossibility. Though how we love the myth of them, how we believe our bodies are until they abruptly aren't. As the brakes on my bike, which the mechanic said were worn to paper, worn out from working so well for so long. As my mother's mind. Like Isaac, my mother is dead, but not. The automatic operations lost, driving, turning on a stove, following a plot, while the ingrained etiquette remains. Lawyer, wife, mother, no longer, yet still a sweet shadow in the soundtrack of every call home. In the mourner's Kaddish, death is not mentioned, just praise and petitions for peace. Though only noon, I tuck her into bed. And though she breathes beside me, I am saying goodbye. There is so much guilt in my grief, but oh, I mourn her while I still hold her in my arms, while I fit my body to hers like a cloak, like a shield, like she taught me. Can you handle staying in Bummerlit for one more poem? Okay. All right, and then the joke. It's after this, I promise. Okay. All right, we're leaving Abraham and Isaac behind for a little while. We'll come back to them. How long before? To move in the wet heat of Florida summer is to be carried in the mouth of an animal. But inside my parents' house, kept chill as a mausoleum, my mother paces and weeps in a ragged nightgown she refuses to change. Her hands, two anxious dishcloths, trying to wring themselves dry. Because I am not the person I'd like to be, I shut the door on this, on my father's poor job of pretending not to cry. And between fences draped in air potato vines, beetle-eaten to a path of tattered valentines, run as though I could leave any of this behind. As Joseph tried to, when he named his first son Manasseh, he who makes forgetting, a word that hints at memory evaporating like water from a sizzling street, that heat hungry as the silverfish swimming my childhood books, leaving holes in all the old stories. But to name someone after what you say you've forgotten is to make of them a neon arrow to the relentless past, one you'll someday return to. This is not that. The mother I've lost is lost for good. The only cure for such decay is its completion, when she's forgotten, even forgetting. In the mountains I've made my home, vine barrens of kudzu, invasive as her illness, mask every gall, burl, and blight. So come, high climber, you foot a night vine. May all her buried memories remain for her unmarked, unnamed. Cover it all with your nullifying green. Be a sea that waves over everything. And if it brings her peace, let her forget even me. All right, here's the joke. Are you ready? Are you ready to laugh? Come on, you can, yeah. So my grandmother is 98. She's still alive, and she is amazing and has this like fantastic Jersey accent. And she likes to call and tell me really long jokes in Yiddish. I don't speak Yiddish, but she tells me that they're so much funnier in Yiddish. I have to hear them that way first. Yeah. So one day she called me to tell me, let me tell you the one that killed at Canasta. So, of course, I had to write a poem called that. So over here, there's actually, we'll see if this works. You can let me know afterward. There's a joke. I'm going to kind of have my hand over here. There's the joke. And then there's like a little bit about my grandmother. So let me tell you the one that killed at Canasta. My grandmother says over the phone, laughing, and all I have to do is close my eyes, and I'm there. The modest brick bungalow on Stanley Lane, the front patio with its white pipe plastic furniture, and in the foyer a dog who for nearly half a century has lifted its ceramic leg to the same silk plant in an eternity of staking claim. In the den, matching orthopedic recliners, and on the fridge, a plump doll with "back off, fatso" emblazoned on a red leotard washed pink by years of South Florida sun. A woman was in the hospital. She begins with a grin so big I can hear it, on what she thought was the last day of her life, when God visited her to say, "Don't worry, Mrs. Goldberg, you've got many years ahead." For many years, God visited only Abraham, leaving Sarah to live on faith alone. My grandfather, too, was the one who dealt with the powers that be for their fish market in Jersey City. Though Bernice kept the books, knew every customer by name, and when the terrified delight of Jaws consumed the country, she was the one who made a sign for the window: "Get even, eat fish." Yet, like Sarah, all promises were conveyed through her husband, all her covenants secondhand. Thrilled at God's words, Mrs. Goldberg paid for the works. Nip, tuck, lift, her butt, her boobs, her face, she got it all done. At 95, my grandmother is only 5 years older than Sarah, eavesdropping on the angel's gossip of her impending pregnancy, when she laughed at God and then denied it, when her withered breasts billowed with milk and Isaac sprang from her, improbable as a rabbit from a hat. But on Mrs. Goldberg's way out of the hospital, strutting out with her new face and new body, she stepped from the curb and was mowed down by an ambulance. I can't complain, my grandmother says every time we talk, but she could. Torn shoulder, bad knee, constant need to keep an eye on her sugar, so her go-to cheesecake recipe, as she tells it, is Splenda in a blenda. Nights, she lies alone, remembering gatherings at the lake, rides on their skiff, the Miss Sugar, the boat she said he was Meshuggah to buy, their little dog troubles. And though it's been a decade since his death, she still curses my grandfather for leaving her to be this lonely. Finding herself in heaven, Mrs. Goldberg marches up to God and demands new. "God, you said I had a long life ahead. Why am I here?" While Sarah allowed herself only a chuckle dusty as a smoker's cough, this far on in her lineage, my grandmother has outlasted such propriety. She cracks herself up before she even gets to the punchline. God looks her up and down and says, "Mrs. Goldberg? Oh, sorry, I didn't recognize you." It's funnier in Yiddish, I don't know. The way a dust plume announces a horde on the horizon, her laughter precedes her, and its joy will outlive her. A sonic Dead Sea Scroll, light from a long expired star. Whatever the transformations, when it is Bernice's time, she will be recognized by her laughter. Thank you. I'm going to assume that was for my grandmother. She's pretty awesome. So last poem, Amy, you were talking about, right? There's Jewish world, poetry world, right? And I think all of us have that. We have poet world, artist world, and then we go back and we have to, most of us do desk jobs and things where we don't feel like we get to bring our full selves. So one of the stories I actually really love in Genesis is the story of Jacob next to the Jabbok River. And he is going to meet his brother that he hasn't seen for decades, who he betrayed a long time before. He sent his family on to one side of the river, he's on the other, and he starts wrestling with someone. Right? And depending on the translation, sometimes it's an angel, sometimes Jacob is wrestling with God, but there's kind of a more modern interpretation, which is that Jacob, on this dark night of the soul, is wrestling with himself. So, thank you all. This will be the last one. God wrestling. The river has tasted the salt of your skin, has lapped at your calves with its current. The river has swallowed the press of your steps. There is no record of your crossing. The river is between you and everything you call your life. So you step into a stranger's arms. Your shoulder fits theirs like a bone in its socket. Their jaw notches yours. All around you, a profusion of oleanders beams back the moonlight, offering a carpet of fallen petals. In your arms, all the promises you've yet to keep, all you've done that shames you. But what is wrestling if not an embrace? It's too dark to see you have the same face, and only like this, cheek to cheek, each looking over the other's shoulder, can you see the world whole. Close at first as a slow dance, you spin and spin, your tracks a tight coin. Matched, you step out, making a spear tip of your bodies. Matched, you step further, levered like rafters, needing the other to stay aloft. Your tracks trace widening circles, ringing out through the fallen blossoms. Names are required only when not alone. This stranger does not give you a new name, just dippers up the true one you tendered in your chest. The day is breaking the night's hold. The far bank is calling. On one side, you, on the other, your life. Join them. Thank you.
Holy crap. Can we have another big hand for Jessica Jacobs, please? When's the new book due out? March 15th. Mark your calendar, ladies and gentlemen. Mark your calendar. Thank you, Jessica. Now I would like to welcome up one of our faculty to introduce Melissa. Ronaldo Wilson, please come to the stage.
What a beautiful poet and poems. I can't even believe it. I mean, this is a nice pairing. You know what? I'm going. It's awkward. I can't even see my laptop. I didn't have time to print. But you know what? Doesn't want to. Do you mind if I move this just so I can see my laptop? I don't have paper, and I won't have to read. Thank you. It's perfect. And you'll forgive the length of it because it's fresh. And, you know, it's kind of long, but it's okay. Where are you going? Melissa K. Wilkinson is a painter with a focus on watercolor. She earned her BFA from Western Illinois University, then went on to earn her MFA in painting from Southern Illinois University. She has served over 20 years as an educator across various institutions in the country, including work as an assistant professor of art painting at Appalachian State University. Her art has been exhibited in 3 editions of New American Paintings, and she has been at the Manifest Drawing Annual 4 times. Her work has traveled to galleries throughout South Korea, Canada, India, and in the US, including at Art Basel Miami. Her honors include an Arkansas Arts Council Fellowship, a Middle East Studies grant, and a National Women in the Arts grant. She is currently represented by OnCenter Gallery here in Provincetown, and she splits her time between New York and North Carolina. What immediately holds me about Melissa K. Wilkinson's painting is its looping surprises of symmetry, particularly in how they provide an immediate looking into subjects that heed and head towards histories in conversation with what I think I recall in Fred Liang's printmaking naming of this as the iconographic space. Back then, last week, when I was a student here, I was excited to learn that I could introduce Melissa. I cannot say, of course, here I know a great deal about the body of Wilkinson's work, but am happily learning about its vast range of territories, of histories, myth, species, speculation, and its dispersal both borrowed from life and returned to the viewer. Somehow, my first feeling in encountering Wilkinson's work was like looking into a kind of local familiar, here or now in her Queen series, the long resin of life, white-skinned midriffs, tanned V-cut shorts, Nike swooshes, inverted, burned-in high shorts, baskets count, even now, pointing, locked torsos, a wrapped ring below the navel. I loved last week looking at the work, and it felt as if for a moment I was out in the streets, a streetwalker, disoriented, engaged in a kind of subjective seeing, held arousal. Here, I'd say in this time, it's almost like seeing a certain kind of Provincetown, a sort of art history, one of Wilkinson's constraints, that haunts and heads at taunting speeds. You are where you are, these watercolors seem to say. You are, in fact, at the mercy of the image in the space of the iconographic, this shows us. Today, as a teacher, but clearly as a student of art making, in Wilkinson's maybe something about the indelible, about time, about the ways maybe too I was talking to Eileen, or to my class, or to everyone about Ellen Gallagher learning from Anne Hamilton how to lock down the subject. The act and event of making, this is what I am thinking of now as a writer. How hard it is to render repetition in such a way that holds down to release sense in visual language. Wilkinson's visual language is hard and cut, city hard, insect hard, eyelash hard, butterfly hard. I learned today more about this obvious dedication to a lockdown capture when the image is the severed into and offhand, through the midriff, into the body of teal, pink, powder blue, these perhaps were the iconic space folds. What's natural and what's not? In Wilkinson's Unnatural series, a body unveiling in watercolors, a mind's eye visually literalized by sheen of teeth and lid, septum ring and pink earlobe bursting on the line. Oh, intimacy ship, is this the assuredness of the immediate? I loved hearing Wilkinson by Zoom in the high COVIDian era. Fold, talk about this process of working with Photoshop, a kind of what she calls a digital sketch process as a means to come to what she says is a sense of the discovery, much faster. In this, my sense is that here too is another fold or warp, contained, a lesson, how to remix the past. John James Audubon, watercolors, as much as an invitation as Pinterest's source texts for the paintings to get at, and in this most private and outside scale. As a human being making art, I understand not simply the need, but the call and the response to the form of the litany of that which we face indirectly or not in the battle and dance with the icon, rhythm. This is what I can say are some quick responses to why and how this matters in my mind's eye. Pink monster tweet, big poetry X. Then evil genius creates a vacuum, a light that burns into the rich windows of an SF complex is the complaint. Sketch, flip, reverse, layer. What happens in the eye of Wilkinson's mix is a compound work of the sheen of the window on an eye, glass on liquid, human sheen, mask, beauty standard, croon. It is this, I think, perhaps the decision to render in the notes of the patterns of symmetry which is connected to deep, dedicated work. I can tell. In fact, I'll close with Melissa's own words, a dedication to dedication. I want to make what I make. I want to make what I can make in order to survive, to enable me to make the work that's all I want in the world. I don't want to be wealthy. I don't want to be famous. I just want to make paintings. In more time, I'd say something about Agnes Martin, kin, or Wangechi Mutu, cuz, or the dentist and the cut and hook tool, the cleaning depicted as butterfly in Wilkinson's painterly charisma into the nervous tug of sense of who we may split between sensed bodies in the paintings now and ever urgent all of the things of which I have been honored to say. How we are so lucky to see and hear some of Melissa K. Wilkinson's beautiful body and bodies of work. Please welcome Melissa K. Wilkinson.
Holy shit, I can die now. Wow. Seriously, I don't even need to talk. Hi, that was amazing. I'm touched, like, choked up. So that's me. Hi, welcome. Beautiful, wonderful people. I am grateful to be here, and I don't think I'll ever probably get a more wonderful introduction. So yeah, I'm kind of dumbfounded, but I'm here to talk about my work. So welcome. Okay, so the best artist talk I've ever sat through was a talk about exclusively influences. Andy Warhol is noted to have said, "I am a mirror." I think of artists, or at least my responsibility, as being more of a filter. So today we're going to sort of integrate the hybrid experience of both looking at influences in order to understand the work that I make, and then of course showing you the work that I make, which is a privilege. No, I'm not that old, but I was a Navy brat, and I start off because I really see myself as a kind of tourist in the world. There's a terrible line in Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club about being a tourist, but I actually think it's kind of accurate in the way I approach the work I make and the decisions that I make. I'm a Chicagoan for the most part. This is literally what it looks like at the top of the Ceres Tower if you've never been there. It's sort of mundane and very much according to the grid, but it is and was for me incredibly diverse. I was your sort of prototypic, tomboy. A rare photograph of my family and my mother, all with mullets. And I was a ham the whole way through. But I was your sort of standard 80s child, single mom. But I grew up, for a good part of it, being a Navy brat, and part of that on the Amalfi Coast in Gaeta, Italy. Very, very beautiful early memories of being out in grottos that were used as Roman amphitheaters. I think as an elder millennial or late Gen Xer, it would be hard-pressed to say that I think this is the moment that really sort of shaped my consciousness in my worldview. And it was witnessing the Challenger disaster live on television, drawing a picture with my father behind me. And when I looked behind him, as it exploded, he shrugged his shoulders. And we didn't have a conversation. And so I think that the dichotomy between those who witnessed the moon landing versus those who witnessed the Challenger disaster really have a sort of outlook and perspective shift. I was raised by the television set. And I think it's important when looking at my work. I do think that popular culture is a valid representation of our values, even if it is somewhat grotesque. I was fascinated by the male body. Right now we're getting through the the oeuvre of Jean-Claude Van Damme movies nightly, and I'm willing to and able to showcase and contextualize that for my brilliantly devoted wife. But I was fascinated by male beauty at an early age. I would pause the television or the VHS and trace Arnold Schwarzenegger's body, which I think says a lot about the work that I make right now. And I grew up during the AIDS crisis, which really did inform my perspective on intimacy and even dating at a young age. And of course, my relationship to being a young lesbian. a baby gay. I realized when I was in undergrad that I was a realist, and realism as a sort of approach philosophically to making artwork. Gustave Courbet is considered to be the father of realism, and he is said to have quoted as saying, "Show me an angel and I'll paint an angel." Why is that important? He painted things that were not traditionally noble in a noble way. These are men who break down huge rocks into tiny little gravel and are paid to do that in the 19th century. It is of a historic scale. It is a history painting. So there's a sort of interesting dichotomy that happens as realism faces the world and its values. I also realized that I was a postmodernist. In short, it's a reappraisal of all those modernist assumptions that I don't think most of us subscribe to now, probably in this room. But the big part for me is that I'm an appropriation artist. I steal because I believe that once you put something out into the culture, we can kind of take it, remix it, make it ours. And I do believe in elevating the lowbrow. As much as we love to hate them, I am highly influenced by surrealism and the subconscious. I wouldn't be able to make the work that I make today without actually engaging with those artworks. And I came out to myself at about 32 years old as a watercolorist. I had to come to Jesus about making peace with not being a gigantic oil painter like my masculine counterparts. Bigger is better is all I heard in school. But what I really wanted to make was a commentary about not only my love for this wonderfully incandescent and gorgeous discipline and medium, but also pushing back at it. It's traditionally attributed to the feminine preoccupation. You know, in the 19th century, young women were trained in watercolor so that they could have interesting conversations with their potential husbands. It's considered sketch-like and in support of giant oil painting. I wanted to really reestablish it in a very different sort of modality and conversation with art history. And this guy that I absolutely love to hate, but I can't help but look at him and kind of understand at least that there is a part of his work showing through in mine, M.C. Escher, and the picture puzzle. If you've ever been to the Vatican, it's one of the sexiest places on earth, with how much Hellenistic sculpture is there, really as a sort of decadent feast of flesh. You really want to question the papal interest in the human figure. And it is at most primarily pagan, which really is a sensual exploration of the body. And problematically, the prototypic representation of the ideal body, which is what I want to engage with and question. But also the transformation of material, which is what my pursuit is as a painter. I take mud and I try to make sense of it. This is Bernini's Rape of Persephone, and it is made of marble. And anything Baroque, anything that really is about decadence and sensuality and a sort of celebration of the world around us, but also the question about what we can actually take with us, which is of course nothing in death. I think of the Baroque and I think of the Dutch 17th century still life as essentially a reminder of your mortality, which is why I have it all up my arm. It's a reminder of why you're here and how quickly it passes. So the first body of work that I'm going to talk about is called Flash Cocotte. Flash Cocotte, if you've not heard of the word, is a type of French queer pop-up party. If you follow the right people on the Insta, you'll get notified that there's a party tonight in this particular place that is a safe space for queer bodies, whatever that may mean to you. And obviously these are safe spaces for a reason, right? So I chose to make, I've got a lot of bodies of work, no pun intended, but totally, we'll go there, that deal with the body, but also a multitude of themes, usually relating to art history. This particular work is really sourced from disco images, Tumblr, still on it, still love it. but really a sort of examination of these safe spaces, which I think has become a sort of like trope at this point. It's sort of a thing that a lot of people roll their eyes about because there is no real such thing. But what these images do is they examine queer joy through the expression of dance and the body. Concurrently, at the same time, I was also doing a series of watercolors of queer icons, like Babs as an icon. But what I was doing is I was doing minor interventions. How I typically prepare these images is I take images and then I do a sort of digital remix through Photoshop, and then I paint them. So I was taking these sort of, Rock Hudson is like the queer icon of masculinity, and then doing a very, very slight modification, reassembling them in order to create a new kind of portrait, one that was meant to disturb, but also sort of agitate. I did dozens of those, and that was the sort of beginnings of me coming to terms with very minor interventions in order to assign myself a kind of ownership or reclaiming ownership. The other body of work that is still going on, I call the Chimera series. If you're unfamiliar with what the Chimera is, it's a mythological monstrosity that would, sort of go around breathing fire. It's the body of a lion with a tail of a goat, another head maybe with a goat, breathes fire, right? I said that already. Super fantastic, breathes fire. But what the Chimera is emblematic of is essentially a sort of hybrid. It's a genetic disruption, one that is understood, at least aesthetically, as a monster, but one that is also sort of mythically preternatural and in its own way powerful and beautiful. So early on in 2021, I started to actually take two component images, splice them together, typically sourced from very, very antiquated representations of both masculine bodies and feminine bodies. Ones that were generally taken from both Hollywood and also sort of early pornography, especially images taken from Physique Pictorial, which is where we actually get the bodybuilder poses. Arnold's pose is literally lifted from Physique Pictorial. And if you're familiar with those magazines, they started out as bodybuilding magazines, but what they really were just excuses for gay men to look at beautiful, other beautiful gay men. And they became sort of really the impetus to create these bodies that were ultimately about what I faced as a child and as a grown adult. Just coming into the fact that these aren't necessarily about gender in so much as they are about the performance of gender and the problematic nature of that binary and how ridiculous the binary is when you put them together. Because one can inhabit both. In fact, all of us inhabit both, obviously. So, images like that, which I actually found really, really destructive to my psyche coming up. I didn't conform to that, I didn't fit to that, but they were certainly women I looked at. Which is problematic. Obviously, that is sort of expanded, and there's really a full spectrum of what I find beautiful. So really it was cultivating and recreating bodies that inhabited very, very different, or at least existing on the fringes, expectations of what desire might hold. And I'm not the first one to do it. I'm part of a long lineage, obviously, especially with the body of work that Robert Mapplethorpe really explored, especially with Lisa Lyon, inhabiting a body that is sort of dichotomously both strong and beautiful, but ultimately traditionally masculine. So the Chimera series continues. These are all done in ink. If you've ever worked in ink before, these are India ink. It's soot with a binder in it, usually like gum arabic. It's an oily, slick kind of material that once you screw up, you ain't coming back from it, which is why I like it. I am very motivated not only, well, we'll go back. I'm very motivated not only by the materiality of what I work with, but as a painter. I was really asked a really pretentious question when I was in school. Are you an artist? Or are you a painter? And the notion that I couldn't be both was absurd to me. because it really undermined my love for this process, this discipline that is really about ritual and history and very much in conversation with itself. Yes, that's kind of masturbatory, but I never found that threatening, because inhabiting a different body and a different identity of what was traditionally sort of assigned to success in the span of art history emboldened me. It gave me license to really investigate it unabashedly. And there is nowhere else I'd rather be than the studio. I think about the work of Georges Giraud. If you're not familiar with his work, he's a photographer. He photographed men in New Orleans, gay men who were what we would say alternative bodies, really to examine beauty as an alternative, but also to create this sort of conversation with Hellenistic sculpture that have fallen over and broken or been toppled over by enemies, these broken parts, but also celebrating them. And I really think about him a lot when I'm thinking about how I remix these bodies. So I have lots of them. I'm on like number 60. My wife's telling me I have 5 minutes. So I'll keep going very quickly. Here's more. Here's some in color. And a lot of them are somewhat familiar. People really love to play the game of like the who's who. Yes, that's Matt Damon. It's not Matt Damon. I can't remember who it is. Doesn't matter. And I never remember who it is. It's not Joey Lawrence either. Matt Dillon. That's Matt Dillon. Anyway, I knew it was a Matt. Who cares with Matt? So people really love to play that game of the who's who, you know, the Rob Lowe. That familiarity is intoxicating to people. It's not something I necessarily think about. I'm really thinking about what these people are sort of projecting, what we have inherited as our understanding of beauty. And I love camp, hardcore. Why? My work is meant to be kind of funny. My work also engages with the notion of the glitch and this sort of disrupted image based on the mathematics of a JPEG. And scrambled porn. As an 80s child with cable, oh wait, I didn't have cable because this is what I saw. Obviously we're thinking a lot about color and form and the aesthetics of what the glitch is. So a lot of them are women that I looked at, that I really questioned whether I wanted to be Joan Jett or be with Joan Jett. And I do paint men. I celebrate them. I'm not afraid of painting men. I find them equally beautiful. Christy McNichol. My first concert. Pat Benatar. So if you haven't read Monster Theory, 7 Theses by J.J. Cohen, you should. He really does sort of frame our understanding of the alternative body and how we've used that and pulled it into popular culture as a means to explore otherness. And queers have reclaimed it as a way to have a conversation about being ostracized, but also being powerful and feared. What do we say? Fierce. A little bit about my process. I'm a traditional watercolorist. I project, I draw it out in pencil, I work very, very slowly, I use luminosity, and I mix color. And that's the end of it. And of course, I think a lot about the gaze. Not the gaze, but the gaze. That was coined by Laura Mulvey in Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. This is an alternative essay where we have the quote there. Ultimately, the gaze can be kind of defined as how men look at women, how women look at women, and how women look at themselves. If you haven't read John Berger's Ways of Seeing, I don't have enough time to read this quote, so I won't. Read it. It'll take a weekend. But, men act and women appear. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. This was written in the 70s by a man. Really framing our inherited perceptions about the body and gender. So some recent work. dealing with the same issues, and repetition. Repetition as being sort of a notion of movement, but also disruption, an alternative body, a kind of octopus, if you would. Is this a sort of autoerotic fixation? Indeed it is, especially homosexuality. That is a question that a lot of people who don't exist in that community ask. And I ask the same questions back at it. So I leave you with the same question that I ask myself every day in the studio. Do I want to be her? Or do I want to be with her? If you want to follow me, you can. Here's my studio, my new cat, and my dog. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Melissa, don't go anywhere. Come on back. I think we need to give a little bit more applause to Melissa Wilkinson. Holy cow, so much to think about. And now we're gonna do a Q&A. The only thing we ask is that you wait to ask your question until Sarah or Miracle get you with a mic, because we are recording it and live streaming it so the people at home can hear your questions. So let's just, are they on?
Hello. We can share.
We can share it.
You can have it.
Well, why don't you just, yeah.
Okay.
I won't set it down. I'll just set it down.
Speak louder.
Hi.
This one's on. Yeah.
In our defense, we just got 2 new wireless mics, so is that an excuse?
We're happy to
Does
share.
that-
We can share.
Because you might want to
We're back.
have a like
Oh, okay.
cool exchange of ideas.
Sweet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'll just talk really loud so I can pretend that. Anybody have a question? So much.
I didn't know whether I want to ask this question or not, but interestingly, just yesterday, I saw the movie Barbie. And is it fair for me to ask you to comment on that?
If I saw it.
Oh, okay. Anyway, the juxtaposition of your work and your ideas and what I saw yesterday will be very thought-provoking to me. I really appreciate what you're exploring. Thank you.
Any questions or comments?
For Melissa, do you ever have a practice of collage?
Early on, yes, I did.
Can you tell us about it?
I sure can. I was trained to not work with photography by very traditional artists who painted as if they lived in the 19th century. I feel for myself, and they make beautiful work, gorgeous work. Their work is about being in situ with people and having real experiences. My work is a facsimile of that. I agree with Picasso in that art tells lies. It was important for me to engage with ephemera, like the printed material, because I think it's important in my practice to make art that is about living in the world today. And that, as a lower middle class, in fact, very poor child, was how I was exposed to art. I lived 30 miles away from the Art Institute of Chicago, and I didn't go there until I was in high school. So I did not have access to objects. How I experienced the world was through print. And so initially when I cut them up, I actually felt very bad. I was cutting up books, which was my link and window to the world, which is why it was an easy maneuver cutting up found material, moving to digital. So weirdly, it wasn't about being more apropos or more contemporary, more 21st century. It was about how bad I felt cutting up images. Does that answer your question?
Hi. Could you speak a little more about the process of getting from your ideas to something visual? Like, do you get, an idea that's visual and then make it by Photoshop and bringing things together? Or do the ideas come from seeing something that you manipulate and then it changes and then you get another idea? Could you speak a little to that?
All of the work is organized in series. You're meant to engage with them in a room rather than one of them stand on their own. When I cull images, I have a theme in mind, or I'm engaging with some sort of art historical movement or expression, whatever. Have you heard of the term micro expressions? Like what I'm doing right now? My wrist, right? Right? Gay women sit like this, gay men do this, and are sort of elegant in a way that I cannot be. I look for moments like that right now, and I grab onto them, and I try to repeat them. There's a sort of grace that I'm looking for. But really what it comes down to is, that mouth looks really wet and juicy, and I can't wait to paint the reflections on that. And those teeth. Ooh, those teeth are blue. So it's combined with a sort of like pleasure that I get from actually crafting with what seems to be vital and important in an image that I want to reinforce. Does that make sense? Okay. So I find an image and then I respond to that.
First of all, I just want to say that was so powerful from both of you from beginning to end, and I don't think that's working. But was it working? Okay. Anyway, and that is why I'm here. I want to see both of you at your excellence, and what I really saw was. And this is not a cut in any way. You are both incredible craftsmen at what you do. But I just feel like you had to do that before you could even go into the poetry and the making. I have the dumb question of how big are those paintings that you make? But more importantly, the largesse of your poetry is in that craft. And it's to go into a world of Genesis, good God, good God, and then to turn around and do those paintings, but that might scare you slightly that they're 8 feet tall when you project them that way. I'm assuming they're smaller. Are they large works? I don't know the scale of them. I couldn't see here. I didn't see the things. That what I did see, they seem smaller. But anyway, the largesse of what you both are doing is palpable, and it's more of a comment than anything else. But I so appreciate it. But I love that it comes from the actual making, that you're both consummate craftsmen, and that is just beneficial to us in such ways. I'm really impressed, but more importantly, I'm moved, and thank you so much. Great. One of the best readings ever.
Well, actually, something I'm really struck by that we get to share this evening is, though it might not seem it on the surface, I feel like we're doing something very similar in a lot of ways in terms of drawing on external material as a means, as you're saying, filter, but also self-reflection, and kind of seeing yourself in a different way. And I think, for me with Genesis, there's something really powerful about being able to engage with something that is so ancient, and that whether or not you believe in it, it has shaped the world that we live in. It's like gravity, right? You don't have to believe in it. Like you're gonna fall down. And so I feel like being able to be in conversation with that has forced me to enlarge the scope of what I'm working on, and to try to ratchet up the level of my craft, to be able to somehow engage with that language, and these really ancient teachings and wisdoms. So, yeah. And I just really love your work. It was beautiful to see. So.
My paintings are small.
Jessica, I had a question for you. I thought it was so fascinating that you thought about Isaac's perspective as being the target that would be sacrificed. And I don't know, I've heard these stories so many times because I grew up in the church, and still listen to commentary on all the biblical books. But that was just so, how did you come to that? Did you feel like, were you at some point the target of a sacrifice or something?
Thankfully, no. But as many good Jews are, I was influenced by Saint Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits. So yeah, no, just kidding. We're going to talk about that with my class. He has a practice called Ignatian contemplation, or imaginative prayer, where you basically sit with a text and revisit it and revisit it. He also calls it composition of place, where instead of like when we're in Sunday school or Saturday school, if you're Jewish, and you're learning these stories as a kid, right, which is you're a passive receiver of these texts. His idea is that the way that you pray is by sitting with a story and actually being inside of it. And you build it in your mind like you would a stage set. And so that's what I did with these stories, is I sat and I revisited them as though I could like walk amongst them up on Mount Moriah. And that's when I start to ask myself those questions, because Isaac lives for a really long time after that. And I couldn't imagine that wouldn't affect him. And there's actually a lot of stories about, he goes blind pretty early in his life. And there's a midrash that it's because the angels wept when they saw that knife raised above him, and the tears fell in his eyes and blinded him. So there's really beautiful source material, and then just sitting with the stories long enough that I could actually like smell what it might have been like, with that kindling when they burnt the ram, or hear the wind up on that mountaintop. So.
Thank you both. My question is for Melissa. Could you describe how you felt when you moved from black and white to color? And then with the Challenger explosion, and like I was just kept thinking about body parts being like in the, I don't know, it was just an interesting thing to show in terms of your background. I remember that too, but then I was just wondering how the body has always been something you've noted.
I worked in black and white for a couple of years because I felt that it simplified things for me. I went to grad school with a guy who painted stripes, and my big question with him was, based on a mathematical equation. They all look the same, except for a little hiccup where the color would change. And my question to him was, how can you do this? With judgment. I said it, with judgment. And he said, it's the confines and the restriction that allow me great freedom. And so I chose to work in black and white because my life was complicated for a couple years. It just gave me peace. There was a reliability to it. So I don't know if I've ever thought about the body parts of the Challenger explosion, but that's macabre. But yeah, I guess. I mean, I love really sick stuff on television. I'm your average white middle-aged woman who listens to podcasts about crime and serial killers. I don't know if it makes sense in my work, but it's certainly what I listen to when I paint. I guess we'll sit with that.
So I want to thank both you, Melissa and Jessica, as other people have said. And I also want to thank Amy and Ronaldo, because my question is spurred from both of their really powerful introductions. I was listening to the introductions as an opening for paying attention to your talks, and one of the things that cut into me was how you all move through intimacy and community, right? Like in terms of whether it's ancient community, the whole historical tradition from Genesis forward, or whether it's community that is both distant in terms of pop culture. I love the glitch and the cable. And so my question is, since you both are so exacting, and I'm following on something that you asked in your question in your craft, right? But you pushed on the idea of perfection or idealized perfection, whether it's the idealized body that is oppressive to all kinds of gender fluid subjects, or the idealized idea or iconography of a god, right? Or a text that comes from that. And so I'm really curious for both of you, is there tension between your quest that's clearly reached in your work for craft at a level of excellence that is idealized or seen as not perfect, but something that one would aspire to, and you're cutting into disruption of other forms of idealized or perfect beings in your work? And either of you can answer the question if you will, or if you wish.
My work does not work well unless you're with it. Painting is not served by a screen. It is, if you're familiar with the practice of photorealism, I consider myself a quasi-photorealist. Like, they fall apart when you're in front of them. So there's the delight of beholding something from afar, right? Something that you think is going to be perfect and ideal and transformative, until you become very close and you scrutinize it and you realize it is flawed, that it is made by human hands, that it is a series of hours of a meditative practice that is and cannot be ever true perfection, that it always falls short. So when I say I'm interested in dichotomies, that's the primary dichotomy that I contend with as a painter. Because my attempt is not to make perfection, it's to make you witness to the beauty of imperfection. That's the best way I can describe it. That's the point of painting to me today.
Yeah, and I would say, kind of building off of that even though there's this idea, if you're engaging midrashically, like with the Torah or the Hebrew Bible, that the text is perfect, the characters are decidedly flawed, and that's why we can keep engaging with them. If they were perfect, well, that's like a billboard, right? Like, you just go past it. You're not going to actually engage with it in some way. It's because these people make terrible choices. They're angry, they're vengeful, right? They betray each other. We can see ourselves reflected. And to me, that's what I'm interested in engaging with, is how can these people, in a way, be a mirror for myself and make me look at my imperfections more closely, perhaps, hopefully, as a means of maybe changing them. But also engaging with Genesis, I've never written about systemic racism or anti-Semitism or the climate crisis in the same way. And these texts made me look at that, right, and made me write about it. But I push myself as hard as I can, but I know that there will come a time, hopefully, if I continue to live and to write, that I'm going to look back and I'm going to realize I could have written something different. But this is true to who I am right now. And an image that's been coming to me a lot lately is of insects that molt, right? And that we get as big as we can and then kind of step out of that so we can get even bigger. And I think of a book almost as a record of that. And then it has a hollow place within it that the reader can hopefully enter and inhabit in some way. But it's a record of that time. And then I'm going to hopefully be able to move on and maybe be just a little bit bigger next time and do something different.
That was so extremely beautiful, and maybe in terms of molting, and maybe the other question has to do with love, the formation of love as the kind of anchoring source work and the poetry and also the painting, and communal love, particularly around, who's left, what's left, what body parts are left, what is the sort of, both circuitous and poetic way, Jessica, to kind of deal with dementia, memory loss and loss. Or, simultaneously I was thinking about, Melissa, just the kind of like that, I don't know that photographer, the New Orleans.
George Dureau.
Yeah, George Dureau as a kind of specter, Mapplethorpe as a specter, that have, clearly very vexed relationship with black bodies, and the kind of relationship with the kind of, not absence of the black body clearly, but in its kind of absence in the work, I was really struck by the kind of your attention to, Leather Tuscadero, who's the kind of black figuration of my favorite, Pinky Tuscadero. There's a kind of doubling there, and dementia's relationship to the bike ride, right? So those sorts of, terminus and indeterminate spaces that ask us to think about family. And I think what I admire and what I am moved most by is the kind of arrangement of love as a source work that probably can't quite be captured. But I think that it will be interesting to see how the bodies grow in this time, you see, which I think is a pressure point of the work, and I admire it, and I also love to see it's kind of, because when I look closely, I was like, oh, these are severed bodies, and bodies pushing into other bodies in a time when bodies have always, in the popular context, have included, all the occasions of the lynching and the Holocaust as compound habits of insect inhumitude, so I'm going there with that, so I'm just really blown away too. I think at the question of craftsmanship and community. Like it just makes me feel like really invested again in the work, and almost what is a white and black painting, and and how do you go back to the white and black now? So I'm glad you're doing the white and black. I'm just saying. I mean, literally and seriously, because I'm over all of the other, ways. But I don't think it's, what I'm saying? I don't think it's accidental. And I think the subconscious is the unconscious. And, I guess it's a question to say, do you feel that invitation? Are you nervous when you're making these marks or writing these poems that skirt, in the U.S. for now today? I love the today, too. Are you nervous? Are you invested, interested still? And what are the kind of politics of, I won't say politics, so what are the gestures of like true love in the work?
That's a big, question. You want me to start with this one? Okay, yeah. I'm gonna hit like a fraction of that. It was beautiful. I mean, so there's a really famous essay comparing Homer's writing, like classical Greek, like epics, and biblical writing. And it's that, with Odysseus, it's called Odysseus' scar. Odysseus, it's always present tense. It's always foreground, right? You hear everything, and because of that, there's no tension, because there's no suspense. Everything is being told to you. Whereas in a biblical text, everything is submerged, right? And it's riddled with gaps, and that is a hallmark of a biblical text. And because of that, I think that's why these texts survive and why they're sacred, is because they invite us to read into those gaps. And I will definitely say at first, I mean, I'm teaching a class on spirituality and poetry. That was terrifying. I would have like priests and rabbis take my class, and like, who was I to talk to them about these topics? But what I could do is I could ask questions, right? And so to me, that is what we are all doing. It's not that I think that I have all the answers, but I like to ask questions. And the thing that I'm really working on is, how do I ask even better questions and bigger questions? And then how do I invite other people in community to do that along with me, right? And because also, if I can give myself permission to ask those questions, then hopefully that's something that other people can do as well. And you can have people of all races, gender expression, sexualities can engage with these texts in a way that we have been really shut out of them for a very long time.
The paintings are small.
Not an impact, Melissa. Yeah.
I work in equations. I am not so poetic. I'm not. I deal with caricature. And when I make a formal decision to stick with black and white, I am absolutely confronting a binary, right? I am aware of the metaphor of the medium. That is always at the forefront of my mind. I believe that the body is connected to the spirit, that it is a gift from a holy creator, that it is connected to my spirit. And the expression of that body in either joy or difference, pain or disembodiment, is simply an extension of my humanity. Which is why I disrupt it and celebrate it. And why do I celebrate it? It's the devotion of the time and the meditation and the recreation. It is a very godlike experience to be a creator, right? So, while I might use the word monster, I'm also reclaiming it. Just like fierce, slay, right? The reassembly is what the portrait's intention is, which is to honor the inhabitant of that body. I don't believe that artists have any sort of special power to look inside the sitter. But I think our humanity is reflected back, which is my job. So that's the best way I can think.
Let's have a big hand of applause for Melissa. Remember, Jessica will be signing books at the back of the room if you want. They're there for purchase. And remember to come back tomorrow, where we'll have another wonderful event with writer Eileen Miles, our very own Ronaldo Wilson, and print